Hello, everyone. I'm Tracy Ariely, end of life doula and founder of Comforting Closure. In today's episode, I'll be talking with Kim Moldofsky. She's not only the founder and CEO of Scrappy Affirmations, but also a writer, having penned numerous articles and a graphic novel titled It's Her Story, Amelia Earhart. Our conversation today centers on the impact of connection in the healing process, particularly following a profound loss. Kim, welcome, and thank you so much for joining us. It's an honor to have you here.
Thank you. It's an honor to be here.
Can you start off by telling us a bit about yourself and Scrappy Affirmations?
Sure. So, Scrappy Affirmations is actually something I started in the late teens when I was working doing PR for MHub, a Chicago based innovation space for physical product development. And as part of my PR duties, I learned to use the prototyping equipment in the innovation space, including a laser cutter. And I literally would fish, here I have a sample, I would fish scraps of wood out of the trash bin and practice making laser cuts and started making these little affirmations on pins and buttons. And that was the very start of Scrappy Affirmations. But I always had this thought of turning it into something bigger than that. And when my job ended last December, because the company I worked for was sold, I decided this was the time to take it up a notch. So in its current iteration, Scrappy Affirmations helps people find meaning in their lives through soul enriching workshops, transformative rituals, captivating talks, and some coaching that I offer as well. We create playful, welcoming spaces that help people share wisdom and discover inner knowledge.
And it's individual, groups, and even corporate.
Correct. All of those things. And with a spin on creativity, I think helping people develop creative confidence opens up a whole new world to them. And that when people take small creative risks, those can lead to big changes later in life. And as you and I have both discussed, having a creative practice is really important in our lives.
Yeah, it is very healing. And since this
Yeah,
is a podcast about aging, dying, and grief, I'm going to focus on that.
sure.
In 2020, your son Isaac died of suicide. Would you be willing to talk about that?
Yes. That was an unexpected, devastating event for our family. It is something that, as people say, it's trite to say my heart broke open, but my heart broke open. It felt like the entire space-time continuum had ripped apart. My brain, it felt like my brain melted, which was something that I know you've started reading about with the Grieving Brain book. I don't think I was prepared for that element of it, but I think there's a greater understanding spreading that traumatic grief is a type of brain injury and that it can take years to recover from that. So I'm happy to have you ask specific questions. We were very open about the fact that it was a suicide, and I think that as devastating as it is, I think adding a layer of shame on top of the grief would have been even worse. And I could see as people comforted us, there were some people that I felt like they would hug me for just a couple of seconds longer than expected or something. And I got a feeling that was often later proved right that they had a suicide somewhere in their family tree that was not discussed, that was thought of as a very shameful thing, and that was hidden and kept buried for many years. I want to add that my son died in 2020, but in 2019, about 6 months before he passed, I had started leading death over dinner discussions. I currently do that under the guise of Scrappy Affirmations as a series called Let's Eat Cookies and Talk About Death. dinner is a lot to ask, I think. So I had started those discussions in 2019, and they are part of what saved me. I think it is so important that we have open discussions about end of life and aging and death, and accepting the fact that this is the only thing we know is going to happen to all of us. I'm happy to answer specific questions.
Yeah,
Yeah.
thank you. I appreciate that. I understand with the shame, and it's amazing, quite frankly, how you navigated through that, because there is so much shame when a person has died of suicide within the family. We've talked about my cousin dying that way, and we didn't talk about it a lot. We really did not, and there is a great amount of shame behind that for, I think, most families who go through that. Um, our society doesn't do well with death. And when you throw in suicide, it just puts a whole nother layer, a layer of shame and blame, I think.
Yeah, and I think shame is just one of the least productive and most damaging emotions that we can feel. We were also really fortunate to have a wonderful community around us, and I'm sure we'll talk a little bit more about that. But I want to add a story about a suicide loss survivor group that I attended, and I'm just remembering this older couple that was there. They had an older adult son had taken his life, and the woman at least was religious, and she was so worried that her son would be doomed for eternity. And that's also a scary thing. And I think most major religions, at least in the more mainstream elements, not necessarily the Orthodox, I can't speak to that, but most, even Judaism, in mainstream Judaism, suicide is thought of as a mental issue, not a selfish act that prevents someone from an afterlife, if that is, something someone believes in or part of someone's faith system. And so I think understanding that can also be very healing. And I just, my heart went out to that woman, and I know how devastating it is to lose a child, and then just to have all these extra layers of pain and grief when there's already so much pain and so much grief is, I think we need to try to eliminate that. I also want to just mention that at my son's memorial service, the rabbi stood in front of the crowd, and before she started the service, she said, point blank, this is a suicide. How many people in this room have been impacted by the suicide of somebody they cared about? And I couldn't crane my neck to look back and see, but my impression was that probably at least half of the people raised their hands. So it is very common, and we just need to bring that discussion out into the open, as we do with so many areas of end of life and death.
I know that the last thing that Isaac did was to make sure that his body was able to be used for organ donation. Can you tell us about that experience?
So we got, the worst possible call at, 1 in the morning, and I knew I started throwing things together to pack my bags. Fortunately, I had family where I was headed, and so I didn't have to worry about those logistics. But I had this vision that I would go and I'd say my goodbye, and that would be, they would unplug the life support machines that he was hooked up to. And when I arrived, this wonderful nurse in the ICU, Christine, when I walked in the room, she started talking about the various equipment that's involved with life support, and what this piece did and what that thing did. And in my mind, I was so confused, because I thought, well, I'm just saying goodbye. Why is she telling me all of this? I'm going to be headed home this evening. And a short while later, a wonderful woman named Audrey came in the room and introduced herself. and told me that she was with the donor network and she was my advocate, and that Isaac had his driver's license with him and had checked the box to be an organ donor. And I flashed back to what I thought was a very hypothetical discussion years earlier when he was getting his driver's license, encouraging him to think about whether he would want to check that box. And he did. Um, so then I had, you know, I, I think I called my husband. I don't, there's so much of that time that was a complete blur, but ultimately, yes, we wanted to support his gift of being an organ donor, and so I got some unexpected insight into that process. Again, I had tremendous support. Somehow, in my memories, Audrey is always present with me at the hospital, even though I'm sure that was not the case. But I know she gave me her phone number, told me I could call her at any point. She would do whatever she could to support me. And it takes a couple of days. There's a lot of complicated things that need to be lined up. There's testing and tissue matching and finding emergency rooms and getting the life flights to, get the organs to the recipients. And so that all took about 48 hours. And again, I happened to be staying with family, so I had plenty of support on the ground in addition to Audrey and in addition to Christine, the wonderful nurse. And I had some friend there as well who was incredibly helpful. And so everything aligned. His organs went to 4 different people. He saved the lives of 4 individuals, and his tissues have gone on to help other people. So that we're happy about that. There's so much about this time that consists of mixed blessings that, again, this was such a dark and devastating thing to happen, but there was always so much love and support and comfort, and knowing that he would go on to help others was also a bright light. You may have heard or seen, I don't know have you participated in an honor walk? Are you familiar with
No, I
that?
haven't, but I did read your article about it, which was really profound and
Thank you.
a great article, and I'll put a link to it in the
Okay.
description. Um, but please talk about that.
So when there is going to be an organ donation, the as they do something called, let me start over. When someone is going to donate organs, part of the process includes what's called an honor walk. So when they are wheeling the donor from their hospital room toward the surgery center, toward the operating room, you have people lining the halls, doctors, nurses. Isaac was in a fraternity. His fraternity friends came. He'd been on a birthright trip. Lots of those students came. He had some coworkers, my family. The hallway was just packed shoulder to shoulder with people. I'm tearing up. It was so sad, but so beautiful. That everyone was, recognizing this wonderful thing that he was doing. And my friend Sarah, who lived out there, was able to arrange. I think I had like hastily texted her. I was like, "Can you get some coffee and donuts and bagels?" And we basically had a mini shiva in the family waiting area in the ICU, and it was remarkable at the time. But then 6 weeks later, when everything was shutting down for COVID, it was even more remarkable to think, oh my gosh, we were standing shoulder to shoulder, or we were crowded in this room. And I want to share another story that I was really impactful, that when I first started having these discussions about death, the very first one I did was attended by a woman who had lost her son when he was a college student. It was a freak accident, and she talked about how when they went to gather his things from his dorm room, how hard that was, but how beautiful that was, because she wound up meeting friends of his that she had never met, and she wound up hearing stories she never would have heard. So even as I was throwing things in my bag to head out to see my son for the last time, there was this little soundtrack in my mind saying, "Oh, but you're gonna hear these stories and you're gonna meet these people." And when we did sort of that mini Shiva, there was a fraternity brother who is from an indigenous population and told me that his father had danced some sacred dance um, in, sorry, in Isaac's honor. And I just heard stories from like his little fraternity brother who wrote me this beautiful note. And this is, someone I never would have met. Um, and so all of that was just so touching and so healing and so wonderful. I will also mention that Isaac's suicide was a gun suicide, and which was a complete shocker to me. Since then, I have learned that the majority of gun deaths in the US are actually suicides and not homicides. So, as scared as we are about mass shootings and murder, we are killing ourselves with guns. And I am not afraid to politicize that. I think it's really important people understand. And one of my requests to some friends back home was seeing if they could find anyone from Moms Demand Action to be part of this honor walk. And two women showed up from over an hour away in their red Moms Demand Action t-shirts and sparked lots of conversations because these college students didn't really know about the group. And I'm really, I don't know who these women are. I don't know their names. I have some pictures of them, but I was really happy that they came to support this and to talk to people. I think the biggest theme is just community, bringing people together, and that's how we made it through and are still making it through.
Thank you, Kim. I thank you for your openness. It's thank you. Can you share with us your journey of grief, the healing process after your son's passing, and how community really helped with that?
Yes. Um, I will say that we were so fortunate to have the support of so many people from the very beginning. And I know it can be a big issue that once the funeral's over or once a Shiva week is over, that support drops away. And we were so fortunate not to be in that situation. We've been very involved in our community locally. We've been very involved in our synagogue. Both of our families have long, deep roots in this area. So we just always had people around us. I remember, I mean, so much of my brain is scrambled from that time. And honestly, after the first couple of adrenaline filled weeks when I was most likely in shock, there's like this blank period of 3 or 4 weeks that I'm not really sure what happened, but I remember at one point making myself an egg, like cooking an egg, and I was so proud of myself, like, "Oh, Kim, you can cook," um, because that felt like the first thing I had done independently in weeks, and that also made me realize how lucky we were that like there was just always food, people checking up on us. It was winter, and there was one morning a few weeks after he died when it was just snowing, a heavy snow out. And my husband and I sat on the couch looking outside, watching the snowfall, and feeling such a lack of any kind of resilience or agency. And we were just like, oh my gosh, how are we going to deal with this snow? How are we possibly going to go out and shovel. It felt so overwhelming. And I just went on Facebook and said, hey, can somebody come shovel? And it felt like 5 minutes later, we were back on the couch. And my husband said, what's that noise? And I said, oh, our friend Debbie came over and started shoveling. And people were just amazing like that. And it's an interesting thing is about a year later, I said to my friend Debbie, I reminded her of how amazing and helpful she was to us that day. She didn't even remember it. She was just like, oh, you needed help. I helped you. But to us, it was monumental. Um, about 6 weeks after Isaac's death, we were in a COVID shutdown. And in Illinois, that was a pretty drawn out and dramatic closure. But my friends would leave packages, everything felt like just a little bit of love. And I was able to do this for some friends as well, that we were just exchanging tiny bits of love, leaving, cookies or a fresh loaf of bread. I was very early on to the sourdough trend. So leaving a loaf of bread, or just like so many little exchanges, even though physically we could no longer be together. And of course, that also, COVID is so intertwined with Isaac's death. At the time, the first case that was found in the US was the day after he died. And so it really did feel like, wow, the world couldn't live without him. Like things just went haywire from the time he died. So 2020 was traumatic for everyone. And I'm sure you have stories about the trauma of 2020 for you as well. And I felt like I had a crash course in traumatic grief 6 weeks before all of my friends did when the shutdown came. And so in that way, I still didn't have a ton of resilience, but I was able to feel like I was helping people as well, the people who had helped me.
I was very lucky in that I live in California. And so we were able to still walk outside, hike outside,
Yeah,
6 feet,
right.
bicycle. I would bicycle with my friends. So we were really lucky, whereas people in much colder environments like yours,
Yeah.
you were really isolated. Um, and what a tough time to be isolated when you're grieving new grief, especially. I know that in many cases with grief, um, the first year you have all the anniversaries, all the firsts, and then come the second year, and people kind of just forget, and they and for many, the second year is more difficult than the first year. How is your community now? Because with support.
Yeah, well, I will say the first year was so weird again because of COVID that we didn't have Mother's Day and we didn't have Thanksgiving, and we just nothing was normal that year. The second year, yes, was also incredibly hard. And now I think my community is still there for me. I think especially in this last year, people are getting back into their lives more. I think things are fairly normalized, and yeah, so it's not at the center. It's certainly not at the center um, like it was, but I also feel like we had a long time to grieve. I mean, when I say we had a long time to grieve, that makes it sound like we're no longer grieving, and that's not. We will always be healing from this. We will never be healed. And there's a great analogy that I heard pretty last year, I think, about grief as a book. So you have grief as this very large, heavy book, and when you're in the immediacy of it, that is the only book that's accessible to you, which is also very fitting. I usually read about 2 dozen books a year, and I read 1.5 books the year Isaac died, and the full book I had read before he died. So the brain fog was just so thick. So you only have this very heavy book of grief, but then as time goes on, your bookshelf fills up with other books, and you have more experience and you're living your life, and suddenly you have like two bookshelves full of books, but you still have that one very heavy book taking the same amount of space on the bookshelf. And sometimes you take it out and sometimes it falls on your toe and hits you, and it's not always predictable. It's not like that an earthquake is coming and that book is going to fall out. Sometimes it just lands on you, and it's an ongoing journey. And from I haven't read the book The Grieving Brain, but I have heard interviews with the author where she talks about it taking potentially 3 to 5 years for a brain to really heal from traumatic and prolonged grief. And I look back and think, would that have been helpful to know? Because that timeline seems very fitting for me. Would it have been helpful to know early on, or would that have just been completely overwhelming? This idea that, what do you mean it's going to be 3 or 4 or 5 years before I feel like I'm a person again? But again, to a large part, that feels like it really fit.
I can't wait to read the book. Thank you for suggesting it. As you saw, picked it up from the library. So,
Yes.
what were some and are some of the most challenging moments in the grieving process, and how do you navigate through them? And I know that you spoke a lot about creativity at the beginning, creativity and ritual. So, how does that play a part?
Well, I'll talk first about creativity. So, a couple of weeks after Isaac died, I'm big on collage. I love collage. I think collage can be very transformative, and I think anything where you're using your hands, it turns off a part of your brain that's normally yapping at you and lets you access a different part, that tap into a different part. So I had talked to a friend a few weeks after Isaac died, and I said, let's get together and make grief collages. And I started this collage. It's an old box of Valentine's candy. So it's a heart-shaped collage, and I had cut it up and put gold glitter glue over it in a cheap imitation of kintsugi, which is the Japanese art of golden joinery. And the idea being that something is more beautiful and strong when you can see that it's been broken and put back together. So I started that collage a few weeks after Isaac died, and then it took 2 years before I could get back to it. It was just too painful and too much. And once that early burst of the like adrenaline fueled phase of grief had passed, I couldn't bear to look at it. But I eventually did finish that, and it's got one side that is the outer side is full of the sadness and the grief, and then the inside is full of love and friendship and support. And it's a nice representation and deeply personal representation of my journey. Another thing that happened was I started doing all these kind of wacky lawn signs during the COVID shutdown. We had a lot of pedestrian traffic on our street, and so I was so upset and angry with the world, but I also knew that's not what I wanted to put out into it. And so I put signs that had, kind sayings or affirmations. And at one point did, with a couple of friends, created what I called the giving tree, where we had ribbons with all these words attached. You know how there are flyers where, you take a phone number or something at the bottom, and I had seen something that said, take what you need, but instead of phone numbers, it was like compassion and kindness and love. And we decorated my tree out front with all these ribbons and all these words hanging that people could take as they walked by. And they did ultimately take them. And it wasn't until 2023 that I met some neighbors that I hadn't known before, and they mentioned my displays and how much it meant to them at that time to just find that little bit of kindness in the world. And I was really touched because again, I thought everybody just thought I was the wacky neighbor, like who's doing this? And so it's really nice to know that people were so touched by it that 2 years later they were, remembering to tell me when they realized, I was the person who lived at that house. Um, and in terms of rituals, we didn't like right away when we were planning the memorial service. Um, I remember saying like, "Oh, we should start a foundation or, collect money for this or that." And the rabbi encouraged us to take a beat and think about it and not feel swept up in the urgency of the moment. And I don't know if that was good or bad advice. When I look back, I'm still, should we have done something or not? Because once we didn't have that urgency, then it just became a very painful thing to think about. But on Isaac's birthday, we do have a little ritual we've been doing the last couple of years, and that is called birthday cereal for Isaac. So when my kids were growing up, we always ate very healthy cereal, except the week of their birthday, we would go to the store and they could pick whatever, like sugar, maxed out, on sugar and dye laden food, cereal they wanted, and it would be birthday cereal. And I had also read an essay by a woman who relied heavily on food pantries growing up, and she talked about how they always got Cheerios and oatmeal and never the fun stuff. And so around his birthday, we do a collection of birthday cereal and bring it to the food pantry. And lots of our friends have chipped in. I have friends across the country who donate to their food pantries, or if they have a little free food pantry in their area, they might stick in a box of Pop Tarts or something fun. And I have to say, each year when we've delivered this big haul to the food pantry, there is inevitably a family that's on their way out and they see us coming in with all this cereal, and the child is, looking like, oh no, we missed it. And, we always let them choose a couple of boxes. So I do feel like that's, one way that we remember him. And somebody had planted a tree in his memory. So we've done some gatherings at that tree, and it's at a nearby park where I walk almost every day. So I get to check in on his tree. But another part of, I think this was an earlier question, one of the things that's really difficult is something I heard on your podcast recently when you were interviewing a rabbi, and one of you said, it's said that a person dies twice, once when they actually pass and once when their name is no longer mentioned. And dead children are an incredible challenge to people. It's not something that anybody wants to think about or confront. And that is, for many grieving parents I know, that is one of the challenges, that people don't say their child's name anymore. And I know that's been a challenge for us, where we will try and work Isaac into conversations, say with our family, and it just sort of drops. It's not something that gets picked up on. And that's a challenge. That's hard.
You're right. People and I think I've said this before that, we say, quoting Dr. Joanne Cacciatore, we say their names, we write their names, we remember them so that they continue to matter in this world. And I think that sums it up for me. That sums it
Yeah.
up. And I know that when we spoke about this before, telling stories about Isaac, people listening, people asking, you don't want people to be afraid to do
Right.
that. And so that kind of goes to the next thing I was thinking about, with your community, with friends and families. What advice would you give to someone that wants to support a friend or a family member that is going through a similar loss?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing is providing space for that. And I never really understood what it meant, this term holding space. Like what do you mean you're holding space? But I understand that now. And a lot of it has to do with our society, and life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and we always want to be happy, and we don't want to talk about sad things or hard things, and grief is just sad and it's hard, and allowing the person to be in that grief without feeling like, oh, come on, we got to cheer you up, like let's go do something that's going to make you happy. They need to process through those very difficult emotions. And I think it was Mary Pfeiffer who said sometimes the cure for the pain is the pain. And I feel like that's very true with grief, that you can't just put it off, because it's like trying to hold back a wave that's then going to come and really knock you over if you don't just work through the waves as they come. Um, so I think just being there and helping the person feel, or allowing the person to feel what they're feeling, even though it might be really challenging for you. Along those lines, remembering that you are there to support the griever, and not to tell them how heartbroken and devastated you are over their loss, because whatever you're feeling, they are feeling 10 times, 100 times worse. And so to have other friends who can support you with your own difficult feelings without having to make the griever be in the position of making you feel better when they're in more pain than you are. I think those are two key things. And then just helping with the activities of daily living. Like we had that friend come and shovel. There was another friend who asked if we had a regular cleaning service, which we don't. And she said, okay, I'm gonna get together with some friends. We're gonna pay to have a cleaning service come into your house. And this was like, I don't know, maybe a month after he died. I don't remember when they came in, but it wasn't something I would have guessed I wanted, but it turned out to be helpful. And even just phrasing something like that, instead of saying, how can I help? Come up with an idea and let the person accept or reject that, instead of giving them the burden of thinking about what they need, because they might not know. They might be so out of it, and in such distress that they can't even think about what they need. And so just making sure a meal is provided. So how about I bring over pizza on Friday night instead of, can I bring you food? Like make a specific request that then they can say, you know what, how about just salad, and can it be Saturday night? Um, for me, everyone's different. Everyone has such an individual grief journey, including my husband and I. And I was very relieved that because of COVID, if people were dropping off food, it meant they were just leaving it on our stoop and going. Whereas my husband really wished that he could have the opportunity to sit and talk with people. So you don't know, you might want to find out, like, does this person want company, or do they want the door drop? Um,
Great suggestions. Thank you. I love how you said that, don't try to change the grief. It's not going away. When I do a lot of grief work with people, as it's part of my job being an end of life doula. Many times I'm asked, or I'm told, Tracy, you could help me. I don't want to feel this grief anymore. I don't want to, I don't want to, long for these people, this person who passed away anymore. How you could help me get rid of that. And yeah, I always tell people there's no getting rid of it. That's going to be part of you for the rest of your life. Not to say that you're not going to feel joy, because there'll come a point where when you think of the person, you are happy much more than sad. But the way I see it, that is part of who you are, and you can't ignore it. That part of you will just get bigger and bigger.
Hmm.
You have to invite that part of yourself to the table and be with that part of yourself.
Yeah, and I will add that in my Let's Eat Cookies and Talk About Death discussions, there are people who are part of these discussions who might be in their 70s who are still carrying intense grief from their childhood because they grew up at a time where the prevailing thought was, oh, children should be at a funeral, or we don't express grief, we don't cry, we're just going to move on. And how many people are carrying these burdens of grief that they did not have the opportunity to resolve earlier on in life? I mean, it sticks with us.
Yeah, we don't have good role models. With death
Yeah.
and with grieving, our great grandparents. I don't think my great grandparents would ever have a body at home, but maybe our great grandparents, when a person passed away, it would be in their home, and the family, including the children,
Yeah.
would see it, and it was much better uh, modeling for people how to really walk through that grief or go through that grief and go through illness and death.
Yes, I think we tend to be very removed from the end of life process and understanding what that's like. And there's a book I just read, so sorry for your loss. It's on its way to you if you haven't received it
I
yet.
did. Thank you so much. I received it yesterday. I really appreciate it. It looks great.
And the beginning, she talks about her mother dying at home, which is something that many people would prefer, right? To be in a home loving environment. But I also don't think we understand, and I certainly didn't until a couple of years ago, how difficult that might be for the family members, and how many people go into this with the thought that, oh, well, hospice is going to take care of everything. And the reality is, hospice is just checking up on you and helping you fill some gaps, but they're not there. I mean, that's why I think death doulas. I had a birth doula. I think a death doula who will vigil with the family is amazing. And the end of life work that I do is really not that level. It's more, let's talk about paperwork, let's talk about concerns, let's make plans for your preferred disposition methods, things like that. But that is so that level of death dueling is not for me, but I can see how incredibly important it is. And knowing the support that a birth doula provided, having a death doula, is really something that I hope more people start thinking about and making space for.
Considering your experience, what do you think is important for people to understand about mental health and suicide prevention?
Yeah, so this for me is a tricky question because I can't really think, oh, if there were this program in place, that would have saved Isaac, or if there were that program in place. I don't know. I don't know what would have helped. And um, Congressman Jamie Raskin, who also lost a son to suicide about a year after I did, has phrased, going back and thinking about those things is emotional quicksand. Like it just, so mental health wise, I don't feel like I have a solution, but I think suicide, it's important for people to know, although I don't know when it comes down to making a decision, if I think they're beyond thinking about this, but I do feel like if Isaac had realized how much devastation his death would have caused, he couldn't have done it. Because I mean, he just the the devastation. I called it a tsunami of grief. So people need to understand that the world is always a better place with them, even though it doesn't always feel like that. We're all here for a reason, and we are surrounded by more love than we realize. But again, if somebody is having a mental health crisis, I know that that's not necessarily accessible to them, those kinds of thoughts. But I do think it's really important to talk about the role of guns in suicide and how more likely a suicide is to complete when a gun is involved. Certainly, it's not the only way suicide happens, but it is incredibly common in our country because guns are so ubiquitous. Um, and that's the only thing I can think of that might have saved Isaac in that moment. If he had to go to a gun shop, which he didn't, and if he had to have, a 48-hour waiting period, something like that, I think that would help. The other thing I would say is, like, we just need to talk about suicide and not hide it away, and we need to remind people of the suicide and crisis text line, which I hope you can put under the screen because I don't
I
want to
will
say
do.
the wrong number offhand. There is always someone to text with or talk to, and yeah, I mean, the numbers of suicide in our country right now are just, it's incredible. It shouldn't be happening. We shouldn't be losing anyone, and yet we are losing children, we are losing adults. I think there are a lot of societal issues that where we could be doing a better job to support one another. I guest star.
Yes, this is my emotional support cat.
Oh,
Oh.
so I will say we have a dog that is the anti-emotional support dog. And he's very sensitive to different noises, like different ways of modulating air. So if you sneeze or if you hiccup, he gets really freaked out. And if you cry, he will run to the other end of the house and shake, and which was very upsetting, having cried almost every day for 2 years and having this dog who's like, not me. I'm not going to help you with this.
Nice. Um, so we're at the end of the hour. So the last question I want to ask to you is, can you share a story about Isaac?
Yeah, I mean, Isaac was a really incredible kid, and he was. So I'll tell a story that like guided his life. When he was 7 or 8, we went to a local library, and there were kids from the high school who had reprogrammed basically like a Pac-Man tabletop machine to play some other games, and the students were there to talk about the experience. And little Isaac was like, I didn't know kids could do that. And that that changed his life. And from that moment on, he was going to be a programmer. And he was almost self-sufficient from the time he was 16. He worked at a coding boot camp when those were a really big deal. And he was 16 and 17 when he did that. And he had students saying, oh my gosh, I'm going to be working for you one day. I mean, he was just brilliant, and his mind ran a mile a minute, which I think was also his downfall. But he was incredibly talented and smart and kind, and will always very much be missed.
Kim, thank you so much for your incredibly heartfelt conversation and your openness, your authenticity. I really appreciate it. And I'm sure the viewers and listeners appreciate it also.
Thank
For
you.
our listeners who want to connect with you or learn more about Scrappy Affirmations, how can they reach you?
Yes, well, I'm just getting started with Scrappy Affirmations, but I do have a landing page at scrappyaffirmations.com. And they can also write me at Kim at Scrappy. They can also write me at Kim at scrappyaffirmations.com. And they can find me and Scrappy Affirmations on social media, I talk to a lot of people via LinkedIn these days as well, but I know that leans a little more professional. Not everyone's over there. But yeah, you can find me on Instagram. My last name is spelled like mold of sky. But Scrappy Affirmations also has an Instagram as well.
Folks, today's conversation with Kim has been a profound reminder of the power of connection in our healing journeys. Whether dealing with loss, navigating grief, or supporting others, the importance of reaching out and building bonds cannot be overstated. Remember, you're never alone. If you or a loved one is struggling, call the Suicide and Crisis Lifeline at 988. Thank you for joining us. If you have any questions, please comment below or reach out to me directly. And if you've found this conversation to be helpful, please like, share, comment, and subscribe. This is Tracy Ariely from Comfort and Closure, wishing you peace and comfort in your journey. Until next time, take care.